In this multi-part series, I'm going to teach you how you can build a RESTful API using ExpressJS and TypeScript. We will be covering things like directory structure, controllers, services, middlewares, databases, migrations, authentications, and many other. The first thing we're going to do is to create a directory for our project. To do so, we can do make directory, and we can name it Express API. Then we can cd into it, and then we can initialize our package.json by doing npm init. Then we can just hit enter a couple times, and then if we list everything, we can see we have package.json. So now let's open up the project in code, VS Code, and start working. Now we need to install a bunch of packages. The first one would be Express, then TypeScript, then the typing for both Express, Node, and we need to install the library for Postgres, which allows us to use database Postgres with Node and Express. Then its types. We will also install ESLint and ESLint support for TypeScript using these two packages. Then concurrently, which allows us to run multiple commands at the same time. And finally, nodemon, which will restart the server whenever some file changes. Now, if you look at package.json, you can find all the packages are here in the dependencies object, which means we are ready to start coding. The first thing I'm going to do here is create a directory called source, and in it I'm just going to create an index.ts file. We will be putting all our code inside of this source directory. And first thing we should be doing here is configuring TypeScript. So to do so, we can do tsc-init, which will create our configuration file for TypeScript. And there are a couple things I want to do. The first thing is changing this to 2022, which will give us the latest features in TypeScript. And then there's a out directory, which is this one here. And I'm going to just set it to dist or distribution. Basically, this means all our compiled code will end up living inside of this distribution directory. Now we can also configure ESLint. And to do so, we can create a .es lintrc, and in it I'm just going to copy paste a bunch of boilerplate, and basically this means that we want to lint and fix any issues found in our TypeScript code. We should also create a ESLint ignore, so we can say ESLint ignore here, and in it we can just put node modules and dist. This basically means we're telling ESLint not to look into the node modules directory or the distribution. Now we can start writing some code. Let's go to index.ts and import Express from Express. We also need to import its type since we're using TypeScript, so we can say Express here. Now we need to create our server. We can say const server and equal to Express, and we want to give it a type as well, so we can do like Express here. Then we need to create our server now, or basically start listening on some port. The way we do that here is by saying server.listen, give it a port, and then a callback. And inside of the callback, you can basically console log that you started the server. So we can do something like console.log and say something like server is running on port 3000. I do like to put this inside of a function instead. So what I'm going to do here is just create a function called start server. And then inside of it, I'm just going to put the listen. And now I can just call start server from here. And this will basically means that we are starting our server on port 3000. So to keep going, I'm going to add a route here. Now I'm going to create a simple route, and I'm going to use it to test our application, make sure everything is working. To do so, we can do server.get, and I'm just going to give it a endpoint called test. Then in it, we pass a function with a request and a response, and we can say response.send OK. So now that we have our route, it's a good time for us to go and configure our scripts to be able to run the app. There are a couple of things here we need to add. The first one would be build, and that's going to be used to build our TypeScript, or basically compile TypeScript to JavaScript. And the way we can do so is by saying npx tsc. Then I'm going to add a start script here, and inside of it I can do node dist and then index.js, because remember, all the compiled JavaScript will end up living inside of this folder or directory. Now I'm going to add our dev script, and in it I'm going to paste this line, and then I'm going to explain what it is. So in this line, we are using this concurrently tool, which will allow us to run multiple commands. In this case, we have two commands, this one and this one. The first one will basically compile our code and watch for any changes to compile it again. And the second part would be running nodemon, which will listen to any changes and restart the server. So now let's try to build our code or compile our TypeScript into JavaScript. To do so, we can do npm run build. And if you wait a second, you should be able to see a folder called dist. Inside of it, there's this JavaScript file. And this is basically all the compiled JavaScript that we will be using for our server. And let's try to run the app now and see if we can hit that route. So we can say npm run dev. And if everything works, we should be able to hit this endpoint on port 3000 and see OK. Let's curl it. So we can do curl localhost 3000/test. And we see here that we get back OK, which means that our server is running and the endpoint we created here is also running, and it's returning OK for us. Now is a good time for us to start structuring our application differently. Obviously, we don't want to leave all the routes in this function here. You can guess that this will end up being super big, and it's probably not a good idea anyways. So let's first close our terminal and stop our server, and then I will remove this endpoint for now. And what I want to do first is I want to create a directory called routes, and inside of it I'm going to create a api.ts. Inside of the api.ts here, we're going to create all our routes. So the first thing you have to do is import router from Express. Then we need to create the router. So we can say const router equal to router. Then you can see router dot all the different functions that we can do here, like get, post, etc. So let's say get, and we're gonna put the URL to be API/posts, and here we can just pass a function. And in Express, obviously, you need to have the request and the response passed here. You can also pass the types, so we can say request, and then we can say here response. And we need to import both. So we can say request and response. And now we can return whatever we want here. But before we continue, I would like to introduce another thing here. So instead of putting the body of this router here, I would like to create a controller directory here, or yeah, we can call it controllers. And inside of it, I'm just going to create a file called posts controller.ts. The idea here is that, again, I don't want to put the body of these routes inside of this function, because you can guess it's going to be huge sometimes. Maybe in this example, it won't be huge, but most likely in any production app, this stuff here is going to be a lot of code. And so instead of doing it this way, what we can do here is let's remove this line, and then we can say post controller dot index. Obviously this won't work for now, but let's get it to work. So we will probably need to import this post controller. So let's say import posts controller from, and this will live inside of the controllers post controller. So now let's start working on our posts controller. So the first thing we're going to do here is creating a class called posts controller, and in it we can create a static function called index. So we can do public static index, and we have to pass the request and the response. So we need to import those two as well. So we can say import request response from Express. Now we should probably pass here async, mainly because in this example we will be using databases, and that always requires an async function. And for this function we're gonna just return res.json, and I'm just gonna pass here maybe like message. Okay. Now we need to export this post controller, so we can say export default post controller, and same thing with the router. We forgot to export that, so we can say export default, and we can pass in router. And in this case we don't need also request and response, because that's going to live inside the post controller. So now we need to use our router, and we don't need to do this here. We can just export default router. We need to use this one inside of our start server. So the way you can do so is by saying server.use, and here you can pass whatever the root endpoint should be. In this case there's going to be slash, and then we need to pass the router. And obviously we need to import this router. We can do here import router from, and if you go router API. Now since we know that this is a REST API and most likely all the API endpoints is just going to live under API, I'm going to add API here and go back to our router and remove it from here. Basically this is still going to be the same thing. You can make a request to /API/posts. It's the same thing. So now let's try to run our app again. We can do npm run dev, and everything is working. And for this example I'm going to use Postman, and we can do localhost /API/ actually we need to pass in the port, so we can say localhost 3000 /API/posts, and if we hit send we see our message. This means that our server is working and our controller is working, and we are now returning the object that we created. So let's continue working on our post controller for a sec. So we have this index function here, and this index function is supposed to return all our posts. So whenever you hit get /API/posts, this is supposed to return all our posts. So there's a couple more functions we need to add. First one would be show, then we need to create a update function, a store function, and then finally a destroy function. And what show does is it's going to respond to whenever a user is requesting a single post. So you can see like /API/posts, and then there's like a /ID maybe. And then update will update a post, store will store a new post or create a new post, and destroy will remove a post. So let's start implementing these. They're going to look for now very similar to this one. So I'm just going to copy paste it to save some time. So I'm going to call this one show, this one store, this one update, and finally we have a destroy. Now if we go back to api.ts, I'm going to paste some routes here. The first one would be for storing a new post. The second one to fetch a single post. Then this one to update a post. And lastly, this one to delete a post. So now that we have both our routes and the controller ready, we should probably start working on adding a database. So as you can remember, we did add the Postgres package here because we will be using Postgres for this project. Now let's create a directory called database, and in it I'm going to create a postgres.ts file. And here we need to write some code that will allow us to connect to the database and to query the database. Here I'm going to paste some code that I found in documentation just to save some time. So the first thing we're doing here is importing a bunch of things. So the pool config, and query result. And we're going to create an object containing the different configuration needed to connect to the database. And then we create an instance of this pool. So what a pool is, it allows you to have some reusable connections or reusable pool of clients. And this is great because you don't have to create multiple clients every time you need to connect or query a database. Then we create a connect DB function, which listens to this connect event. And if we are connected, then we're going to log connected to Postgres. If we have any error events, we're just going to log that as well. Finally, we create this query function, and in it we accept the query and any params we need to pass to the query. Inside this function, we just connect to this pool, and then we try to query the database. If we have any errors, we're going to log the error, and if we don't, and after we query the database, we will release it, or basically release the client, and then simply log that the client has been released. Now that we have some code that will allow us to connect to the database and to query the database, we still need to create the actual database. So for this example, I went ahead and did so using a tool called TablePlus. So I have a database called my app and a table called posts. And inside of posts, I have the ID and a post field. ID is an integer, incrementing, and then a post is simply a varchar or a string. So now let's create an example post. I'm going to give it an ID of 1 and say here example post. And now we have one post in the database. Now we need to figure out a way to query the database and use that data for our API. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a directory called services, and inside of it, I'm just going to create a file called posts.ts. Inside of this posts, I am going to use our query function here to query our database and fetch some posts. So the first thing we need to do is we need to import this query from our database. So database / Postgres. And now we can say export async function, and we can call it, for example, fetch posts, and this will return all our posts from our database. And let's just say const result is equal to await. We can use our query, and we need to pass in our SQL query here. So we can say select star from posts, and we can just pass an empty array as params, and then we can return result.rows. Now that we have this function which will select all the posts from the database, we still haven't really connected to this database. So if we go back to our index.ts file, what we can do here is we can say await connect db, and it will import it for us here. And since this is an await function, we need to also do async here. Now let's try to use our fetch posts here. If we go back to our post controller and we say const posts is equal to fetch posts, and we have to use await here as well, since it's an async function, then we can pass these posts to the response JSON, and this will basically return all our posts whenever you hit /API/posts. So we can run our server and then head to Postman, and if we hit send, we should be able, as we see here, that we can see all our posts. Now if we go to TablePlus and add another post, let's say it's called post2, and we can give it an ID of 2 and save it, and we go back to Postman and hit send, we will be able to see all our posts, the 2 posts that we have here. Now let's continue working on our post service here. There's a couple more functions we need to add to basically show a post, create a post, update a post, and finally remove a post. So I'm going to paste some code here as well, so just save some time and format my code. So the first function I'm adding here is fetch post by ID, and it basically does what it says. We're going to fetch one post by its ID, and the query is select star from post where ID is whatever the ID we passed here. And the second function would be to create post, and then to update the post by its ID, and finally to delete the post by the ID. Now if we go back to our post controller, we can start using these services here, these functions, and for the show, we will be using this fetch post by ID. Now we can use our fetch post by ID inside of this show function, and what we can do is const ID. We have to pull it from the params, so we can say request.params.id. And now we can use our function by saying const post is equal to await fetch post by ID, and then we pass in the ID here. And finally, we can just return the post inside of our response.json. Now, if we run our server again, so npm run dev and head to Postman, and if we hit the posts again, we see all our posts and we have this ID equal 1. So if we put /1 here, we're expecting to see just one post, which is this first one. If we hit send, as you can see, we're only getting the first post. So now let's head back to our post controller and finish implementing the rest of the functions. The first thing we're going to do here is const post is equal to request.body.post. And this post here is coming from Postman's object that we're sending. So here we're going to be sending post, let's say my new post. So now we can do something like const result is equal to await create post, and inside of it we can just pass our post. So another thing to look into here is if you go back to create post, you can see that we are returning star, which means that whatever we create here or insert into the table will also be returned. So result here will contain the new record that we just created. So we can return it as well here. And instead of OK, let's just say created a new post. And now if we run our app, we should see an error, by the way. So let's go to Postman and try to create a new post. And it says, cannot read property of undefined post. So for some reason, we're unable to read this post. We can't find it. So we are sending post here with this message, but we are unable to read it. So in Express, one thing you can do is we need to pass in or add in a new middleware, which comes built in with Express, which allows us to read and interact with JSON. So the way you can do so is going to this index.ts file again and say server.use, and we need to do express.json. Now our app knows how to work with JSON. So if we restart our app again and go back to Postman and hit send, we should see that we have created a new post, and this is actually the new post that we created. And if we go to Table Plus and refresh, you can confirm that this is our new post. Now, if we head back to our post controller and work on our update function, we need to accept first the ID. And so it's request.params.id, very similar to this show. And we need to accept the changes. So the changes, I'm going to do const say changes is equal to request.body.post. And so we know that the update function is listening to this endpoint, which is put API/post/some ID, right? So the way we can do that is we can go back to Postman and update post to put, and let's say we want to change like this post here. So we have the ID equal to 4, and say here update it. So here we need to first do update post, and then we need to pass in the ID, and then let's say changes, and let's say const result is equal to that. And now we can pass in the result here, and let's just say here updated the post. Now if we head back to Postman and hit send, we should see here updated, which means that our post has been updated. And if we go to table plus, refresh, we can see that the record has been updated. Finally, we can start working on our destroy, which is delete function. And here, very similar to the show as well and to the update, we need to get the ID from the params. And we need to simply just call delete here. So what we need to do is, for example, const result is equal to await. And what did we call it? It's called delete post, and it accepts an ID. So we can say delete post, and we need to import it, and we can pass in the ID. So the result here is similar to this update and to the create. Because we're returning star, this means we're going to have the actual record that we just deleted. So let's just pass it here, and then instead of OK, we can say deleted the post. Now if we go back to Postman, and instead of put, we can use delete here, and we want to delete this post with an ID of 4, and it doesn't matter what we pass in the body here because we're only really pulling this ID. And if we hit send, it says deleted the post, and this is the post that we just deleted. And if you go to table plus, we know that this is the post that was just deleted. If you refresh this thing, you see that the post has been deleted. If we go back finally to our post controller, you can see that all our functions has been implemented. We can fetch all posts, fetch a single post, create a post, update a post, and finally remove a post. Let's go back and review everything we've done so far. So I'm going to close all the files here, and let's head back to index.ts. So the first thing we've done here is we created this function called start server. In it, we connect to a database, we use our router that we just created, and then we listen to port 3000 when we start the server. We also created an api.ts file, which is a file that contains all our routes, and it points to this post controller. And in the post controller, we created all the handlers that we need for the different routes. Then we wanted to connect to a database and interact with it. And so we created this database/PostgreSQL file. Inside of it, we connected to the database using this connectdb, and we listened to the connect event and then the error events. And whenever we are connected, we log this connect to Postgres, and whenever we have an error, we log the error. And also we have this query function that accepts the query, the SQL basically, and then the params through an array. And then in it, we just connect to the pool, send the query, and then finally release it. And lastly, we created this post.ts file that lives inside of the services, and in it we created some functions that contains all our queries. And we tested everything using Postman, and we interacted with the database using a tool called Table Plus. Thank you all for watching this video. This was part 1 of 2-part series I'm working on. In the following video, I'm going to introduce you to things like environment variables and how you can work with them, how you can use migrations to create databases and interact with database using code, how you can model your different tables, how you can implement authentications, and how you can use middleware, and finally do some caching using Redis. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.